Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 13th annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I am Jean Anderson with the South Central Library System, and I am moderating the Reference and Readers Advisory track today. Assisting me today is Angela Schneider with the Winnifox Library System, and we are glad to have you here. Our presenter for this session is Misha Stone, a Readers Services Librarian in Seattle, Washington, who will be presenting Books Are Our Brand, Reinvesting in RA. Misha is going to take questions throughout the presentation, so go ahead and submit those questions anytime in the Q&A panel or in the chat box. So Misha, whenever you are ready, go ahead and begin.
All right. Thank you so much, Jean. And hello, Wild Wisconsin. Thank you so much for having me here. It was really lovely seeing also people participating in that opening gambit, that opening chat. So it's good to know that some of you are dialing in from small libraries, from academic libraries. I wanted to thank Jean and also Angela today for inviting me here. And I'll say that I sort of got invited to do this because of a blog post I wrote last year that got posted on Becky Spratford's RA for All blog. It sounds like some of you have already been in some of her trainings. She and Robin Bradford, who you're going to hear from later today, do amazing work in really breaking down sort of and demystifying Reader's Advisory and also working on actively anti-racist Reader's Advisory. But I wrote a blog post sort of to some degree in a fit of pique. I was like, we all have things that we get annoyed with in our field, right? And I really wanted to address the thing that happens a lot in terms of the phrase that comes up a lot, and administrators will use it, other staff will use it, about how we're more than books. And I understand why that happens, right? Like telling the story of all that we do is really hard. We do so much in our communities, we do so many different kinds of things, and we do so much work that it's hard to really sometimes get down to the essence of what we do. But we are books and more rather than more than books, because trying to say that we're more than books is playing to detractors. It also shows the ways in which we fall into binary thinking around this work. So I really believe that we need to really reinvest in understanding why books are foundational to all that we do with communities, to all the work that we do. We don't get to the more without the books. So our collections are our strength. It's also the reason that we are feeling the kinds of attacks that we're feeling about our collections. So showing the ways in which we still value that, how it's intrinsic to our work, is really important. So thanks again for those that read it and are continuing to think about these things. But I wanted to come today to kind of reaffirm Reader's Advisory as an investment in service, and also the ways in which it is related to reference, okay? So I wanted to talk a little bit about investing in collections and staff training and creating more reader-friendly libraries. But I'll start by introducing myself and why I love this work. So I have been doing this work, Reader's Advisory, since I was a student of Nancy Pearl's back in the early aughts. And so now I find myself in situations where I get invited to go on TV. This is a local Seattle morning show called New Day Northwest. This was their previous host, Amity Adrisi. And I often go on every few months, and sometimes with colleagues, to just talk about new books and or a variety of different sort of genres, things like that, trying to meet readers where they're at. And that has been a really fun thing. But in the course of my work, like, here's a couple things that still delight me. Recently, I was on and talked about, if you know who T. Kingfisher is, she's a writer of horror and fantasy. And someone had taken a screenshot of my talking about one of her books, and she said, "A truly epic librarian apparently just put my fantasy romance with severed heads into the hands of a morning show host, and I cannot stop giggling uncontrollably." I claim to fame. I love that. Like, just the fact that she saw that. And yes, that is actually true about that fantasy romance, that there are a lot of severed heads in it. So yeah, she is a delightful author. And just the fact that we get to do this work collectively to sell the praises of fiction is really one of the things that keeps me motivated. But in the course of the work that I have done with readers, I've done it in a lot of different settings. I have assisted with drag events. We've done bookish drag events celebrating banned books and the freedom to read. We've done community events with QD BIPOC community, ballroom culture, celebrating queer books and collections and community. I used to show up at events with a bike and in our Books on Bikes program, where we'd get together and basically show up where community was at festivals and help people find books to check out there. So there's just a lot of rich territory to explore in this work. I've also had the joy and honor of hosting a number of wonderful authors who come through town. Recently, Stephen Graham Jones, Rebecca Roan Horace, just hosted Jeff Vandermeer recently. So yeah, there's just a lot that I find really wonderful about this work. During the pandemic, trying to figure out how to do online programming was a real challenge and a joy. So one of the things I'm really proud of was putting together a bisexual romance panel online, which you can find the recording of, that had people like Casey McQuiston, Alexandria Bellafleur, Rebecca Weatherspoon. And as a result of some of that work I did, and trying to figure out also how to just connect with readers, bring authors together, and work with community partners during the pandemic was, a thing. So I think we all have stories about the work we did and how we still managed to do some of that work in a really challenging time. I received an award as a result of some of that collaboration, which I'm very proud of, but I'm proud of that program. So, one of the reasons I think that Reader's Advisory is so important, and all the ways that some of you were speaking to this, thinking about the little day-to-day, figuring out who your colleagues are that love a genre, connecting with readers who know that they can come to you for help reading a particular genre is great. What this is about relationships and connection. And that is what we're all about. But Reader's Advisory is another place that we can kind of deepen some of that work. So I wanted to just really touch on the ways in which we don't always talk about helping leisure readers, helping pleasure readers can be meaningful in ways that we don't always really think and quantify around. We talk about how our reference services maybe help someone with a student paper, with getting a job. Do we talk about what we do with readers, with readers just looking for a good book also makes meaning? Okay, so I'm going to read this passage, which is actually really hard for me to read because when I encountered it, and even now when I think about it, it still really is gutting for me. But this is Elsa Hunnison, who was just in the New York Times, I think last week, in an article about the importance of vaccines. She's a disabled activist and writer. She's won Hugo Awards. And I met Elsa when she was a teenager in Seattle. And this memoir, I read it, and I didn't expect this, but I'm going to read this passage, okay? At 16, I thought about throwing myself off of a highway overpass. It was on the way between my house and the library, a walk that I would take all the time. Half an hour up and down hills, through Seattle's Capitol Hill, and eventually to the overpass. I'd pause there each time I crossed it, somewhere in the middle, and stare over the edge. I'd watch the cars as they zoomed underneath me and sometimes visualized pitching myself over the side. I never did, of course. There are always books to read just one block further. Two librarians who were ready to hand me James Joyce, Connie Willis, Octavia Butler, Lois McMaster Bujold. The librarians were, perhaps wittingly, my saviors, the people who kept me from drowning. With every stack of books, with every chat about what I wanted to read next, they were helping me to stay alive, because I am the sort of person to stay alive for the next good book. And I think you can tell I have a hard time reading that because it's really, we don't always know. So after I read that passage, I reached out to Elsa and she let me know it was about myself and a colleague. But that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm really getting at is the fact that we never know the meaning that we're making in people's lives. Sometimes we never get to know. And I don't want to, we have to be careful of savior complexes in our work and vocational awe. But just know that sometimes creating those spaces where we are giving someone a good book to read, we are saving them in ways that we'll never know, right? So helping someone get a job is just as meaningful as helping someone find a great romance, okay? So think about those connections. Think about the meaning that we're creating in people's lives, because a lot of this work can be life-changing and life-saving. So I love this little image here because it's about, when you're sitting there with a book, and of course, there's many different ways that people read and audiobooks and so on. But what it looks like is very different from what it feels like. So there's just all these ways in which we open up worlds for people in the work that we do. So I wanted to stop and share. It looks like there's some chat. I don't know if, Jean, there's some things that people are asking that I should know about. But I wanted to know how confident you feel in this work, whether or not you get ongoing training, and if they're dedicated positions to or teams focused on RA. And I'm sure that's going to vary depending on where you're at. Um,
Yeah, I haven't seen any questions yet, but people were commenting, about whether or not they offer RA services or specialize in it. But I also, since you mentioned Nancy Pearl, have to share that I have my little Nancy Pearl action figure, and
uh,
it's signed because I saw her at
oh,
a conference and she signed it. So I had to go and show that for you. She's one of my original heroes of Readers Advisory. So thank you for letting me share that. Let's see, people are saying it's kind of a team effort here. Um, I haven't seen anything else with questions and whatnot. Let's see. We do not have training. We mostly wing it and lean on each other's reading experience. So, well, we're glad you're here. Consider this today. And our staff does random webinars on RA for a variety of genres. They're short, interesting, and relevant. So good that you're doing that. Um, that's all that's coming so far. We'll keep watching the
okay.
chat.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and I know there's a lot of excellent trainings out there that you can find. Novelist, if you're a subscriber to Novelist, does a lot of ongoing trainings to keep you sharp and keep those conversations happening. And we are resources for one another. So in this little, you probably know about, some of the every reader their book. Jenkins Lumpkin did this RA reimagined piece in a presentation, and every person their RA approach. Uh, uh, and one of the things she said also is that Readers Advisory provides us a crucial opportunity to forge a space for patrons to become fully themselves as readers. In essence, Readers Advisory provides the opportunity to communicate. It's safe here. Let's explore and discover together. It is a transformational moment, not a transactional one. A time to create the feeling that your next book is just around the corner, even more perfect than can be imagined. So that's one way to kind of be thinking about this. Save the time of the reader. Books are for use. It's getting into Ranganathan's laws of library work from a reader's advisory perspective. But I wanted to get to in the ways in which RA and reference are connected, right? Because we still separate them. And in many library schools, and again, in some of the trainings, once you enter libraries, there isn't a lot of emphasis there, right? Like we don't always see the ways they're conjoined. We all don't always do sort of ongoing work there. Um, but information and stories is where we enrich people's lives, both in the reference sphere and the reader's advisory sphere. They are connected. And in many cases, we're serving the same patron over the continuum of either their day or their lives, right? We're giving them all kinds of information to cope, to make changes, to equip themselves, personal growth and intellectual inquiry, life skills. All these things are found in that continuum of reader's advisory and reference. And I wanted to share another story, which happened recently. There was a patron that walked up to my desk and was looking for urban fiction. So I gave her a stack of some urban fiction, some sort of represented here on the left. And she just, was really excited that I was able to give her some. And then she said, "I'm also here because," and this is a really young person, maybe in their 20s, and said to me, "I just learned that I have 18 months to live and I need some end of life, materials too." So I sent that patron up to my colleague on the seventh floor in the business department. And I wouldn't have known how that went unless my colleague had ended up posting about it on Facebook later. And she said, "I had this really meaningful interaction with this patron. And, it just really sort of like stunned her, just the kind of the ways in which we authentically connect with patrons in their times of need was really sort of, humbling. And she was just sort of, working through her feelings around that. And so one of the things that I, was reflecting on with her was that we both served that patron that day. That desire to read some books that might help that patron escape into another world were no less important than some of the things that were needed for end of life. So yeah, it's often we're serving the same patrons. It is connected, and yeah, it's we're helping people in a number of ways, in ways that we don't always even see the connections sometimes. So when you see those connections, you see that continuum, even in a given day, for someone's needs is kind of remarkable. Um, and I wanted to get into the ways in which we do see these things separately, right? E. Lawrence is a uh, professor at Rutgers, assistant professor at Rutgers, and he and Virginia Sharp wrote this book just last year on RA versus reference and how we think about these things now. We can think about them differently. One of the things I'll just touch on a few of the things that they say, but readers use fiction as a kind of alternative possibility that informs their thinking about the world. And thinking about the ways in which this is connected is that it's also an information seeking behavior, right? I'm just going to dive into this because I kind of love what is being said here. Although they don't normally think of themselves as involved in information seeking as such, it turns out that when looking for books to read for pleasure, avid readers constantly scan their environments for hints and suggestions, using their previous experience in reading to help them interpret clues. That is, the very act of looking for a book to read is itself a complex form of information seeking. A cryptid romance title to check out, or names of contemporary mystery authors inspired by Walter Mosley, or even just a recommendation for the kind of audiobook that can be read in small increments between work and childcare obligations. These are desires that represent information needs, even as the desires themselves are for a particular kind of experience, and require information seeking activity to be satisfied. Um, and this is also just putting the right resources in the right reader's hands and looking at the ways in which reference and reader's advisory sort of do that in a conjoined way, right? Um, so, RA involves information seeking, but why is it always pleasure reading is often dismissed? We still have this issue in our field, and it shows up sometimes in, again, a lack of commitment to training. We often think that without training, it's somehow happening, right? So one of the things I wanted to also ask you all is Reader's Advisory, at least in my system and some of the area systems, really became a star during the pandemic when we had to close our doors, when we had to really reinvent ourselves during a time when people couldn't come into our physical spaces. Reader's Advisory became a star when we started doing, curbside. But what did we learn? What are some of the things that happened at that time that you think were interesting or innovative? And did you see them continue to get applied? Like, did they still get invested in when we ramped back up into being open? I think those are questions to ask ourselves continually, is like, what did we learn from these different periods? How are we reinvesting in some of this work, and how are we building capacity in ourselves and our systems? If you have anything to share, yes.
Yeah, so go ahead and add your pandemic RA stories in the chat. I wanted to share what Deb said. She said, in our small community, RA is often done by our patrons. A patron will come in and want to read a book because their friends were saying how good it was. I love it when a patron comes in and says, have you heard about this book?
Yeah, and thanks for that. I was telling Jane and uh, Angela earlier, is that, like, I work at a desk that has a sign that says readers suggestions. And the way I look at this work is that we are not necessarily experts. We share expertise, and we share expertise with patrons too. There are readers that you're going to help that read circles around you in a given genre. It's not necessarily just about what have to share with them. It's what they have to share with you as well. Again, it's relational rather than transactional. So yes, absolutely. Creating that ecosystem where the patrons will share with you too is absolutely important and part of what we need to be working on. Yeah, I'm often suggested books to read from patrons. And there's an online personalized reading list service that my team is involved in. I get so many great thoughts and reading ideas. My TBR, right? Like,
yeah.
out of control. Um,
I'll never
yeah.
get through my TBR.
Yeah. I know, occupational hazard. There's just
Yeah.
no way. Well, if there
Uh,
are any other
so
thoughts,
Yeah, so a few people said that they really promoted their digital sources like Hoopla and Overdrive and Libby. And then another one, Jessica said we need to be aware of our own collections as well as outside resources like Novelist. And for those in Wisconsin, we have statewide access to Novelist as part of our BadgerLink resources. So all libraries in the state have access to that.
that's really great and lucky. I honestly I couldn't do the work I do without Novelist. I so appreciate them. They're really a wonderful tool, and it's a tool we can share with readers too. So if you have access, I hope your patrons do too, and you can show them some of what's available there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, then the access for novelists is for patrons. It's a statewide, one of our
Yeah,
statewide resources. Mhm.
yeah,
Yep, and
totally.
that's all that has come in so far.
Okay, thank you, Jean. So I wanted to touch on Library Journal does this great roundup every several years in looking at readers advisory in libraries. And in 2021, so again, sort of like, mid pandemic, I don't even know where we want to position ourselves now in relation to the pandemic, but we can think of those early years. And some of the things that they did is I looked at sort of, how confident did staff feel, how much training, how many folks who have their MLIS had readers advisory, classes back when they were in school. So they do these audits periodically with library workers just to see where they're at. And just hearkening to what I just mentioned about what we learned during that period, which you're right, like figuring out how to market our online collections, making lists, um, creating findability tools, right, for some of those things were really important. But Reader's Advisory, here's one of the managers said, Reader's Advisory is one of the most rewarding parts of librarianship because it sits at the intersection of service and culture, especially for those of us who entered the profession out of love of people and books and reading. RA provides us with work that is challenging, interesting, and meaningful. It's also a great justification to read more widely, keep up with what's new, and network with one another. Librarians are heroes many times over for the work they do, but Reader's Advisory is work that enriches our lives at least as much as the lives of our patrons. So I actually really love that example of the patrons doing RA too. But potentially one of the things you can do is if you're able, we used to have a book group that was open-ended and informal called Let's Talk About Books, where we brought together, one librarian would lead it, but then it would be community members coming together to share. We had a timer that we were like 3 minutes or less, right? Because we wanted to go around the table maybe once or twice, and everyone would share what they'd read recently. And that was really a great way to both bring community together, make connections between people, and also give them the opportunity to share. And it was so fun watching how they influence one another's reading. So, a book that someone mentioned maybe 3 to 4 months ago would come back and someone else would have tried it and have something to say. And that was really great. Um, so another quote here is, I think we all now have an extra appreciation for the value of in-person readers advisory as a tool in building relationships with our patrons, matching books with their current reading needs, and anticipating their future bookish wants. I love that, future bookish wants. Okay. The main interaction we have been experiencing with many of our patrons lately goes as follows. It's great to be in the library again. It's great to see you in person again. What have you been reading during the past year? What have I missed? What could you recommend? And it's a great opening for all of us library workers who love providing readers advisory because there were so many beautiful, exciting, memorable, and enjoyable books that helped us through the last several months. So I think in the years to come, looking at the ways that we can connect with our readers and help them get through the times we're in is really important. I may not read some of this, but maybe just one of them, but this is part of that same library journal review. Is LJ by the Numbers 2021. And it looks at sort of like, what they learned from that time. Someone said we started hosting a Bring Your Own Book Club virtually. It's kind of what I had mentioned in March of 2020. A year later, we have regulars who come every other week with a long list of books to talk about. It's helpful for me as a librarian to hear what people are reading and why they like or dislike the book. So think about the ways in which you can connect, that you can create spaces, because it's going to grow your confidence and your knowledge and things. So I wanted to dive a little bit into getting started and staying sharp. Um, Again, some of us are doing it in the middle of really busy, library environments. I know that trying to do this work when someone's, there's all kinds of fires you're trying to put out, or there's definitely people in crisis, right? But thinking about just doing small things every day. It's about listening and relationships and letting people know we do this. It's not always, not everybody's had a great experience asking for a good book to read because they may have been shut down. They may have been shamed for the genre they like. And often I find that readers will say, ooh, can I ask for more trashy romance? They feel the need sometimes to qualify or apologize for what they like. And so everything we can do to break down that work, think about the ways in which we are authority figures, whether we realize it or not. What can we do to be more celebratory and welcoming? Um, and some of that can be, again, putting together programs, small little interactions every day, co-curation with community, reader engagement, and trying to connect people around a shared love of reading. And I wanted to get into, like, novelists got mentioned, and we are going to be in a space where we're talking a lot about algorithms and AI, right? Novelist is done by librarians. So some of that metadata, some of that appeal analysis that you get in novelists, you get, right, from like library workers. So what do we do also to position ourselves in a world where we're going to increasingly be, as we all are, like the very phrase more than books is, are responding to being told that we're not relevant, right? Um, and that's not true. We know that's not true. So what do we do to continue to create value is thinking about how people are better than algorithms. And this is a Lit Hub article that's well worth reading. And here's a little take on it. That same article by librarian Alex Brown. And they said, I love that this article digs into how RA isn't just recommending a book. It's under the reference interview umbrella. What a patron asks for is rarely what they actually want. And it's our job as librarians to tease out that difference. AI can't do that. It will never cease to amaze me how my fellow librarians are so determined to cede over crucial trained parts of our job to automated services. We need automated, I know. Some of it we do need. But I know we're all overworked, underpaid, and providing too many services, but we also need to do better at protecting our core work. RA is about getting to know a patron, even if only for a minute or two. It's about understanding the current and historic book market. It's knowing how to guide deeper questions, ask deeper questions that can guide you to the heart of their request. And it's not just tags and keywords. So reinvesting in books as our brand, reinvesting in Reader's Advisory in relation to our reference is about creating value and creating a meaningful experience and more relevance in all that we do. So I want to start by just saying, practice curiosity. It was mentioned that some people, are the go-tos, right, in their libraries for certain genres. Think about continuing to expand that for yourself, right? Like, if you haven't read a romance in a while, if you haven't read a horror novel in a while or a mystery novel in a while, you may have bias towards some of those genres that you don't realize you still hold. And these genres keep changing. So, open yourself up to trying new things because Reader's Advisory is not just about what you love. Now, it's great. It's great when you get to connect with readers that read just like you. But we need to be able to continue to stretch into helping readers that are absolutely not like us and learn with them, right? So making it fun and interactive, talking with that reader, sharing resources, swiveling the screen to show them the search you're doing, making it less opaque, working through the terror you might feel when someone asks you for something that you were like, that's not my jam. How do I get into that one, not without saying, oh, I don't like that, which like, ooh, let me, I have a colleague who really loves that. Here's what they said, but also let's use this resource to kind of go further, right? Because people feel it when we get panicked, and sometimes that's okay. You can own that, but just like say, "Hey, I totally want to help you. This is not my purview, but let me get started." Right? That's true of all reference interactions, right? But also making sure that we're intentional on what we display, what we put on lists, and making sure that we understand that we are positioned in, in a publishing industry that is predominantly white, cis, and het. So promoting books by Black, Indigenous, and people of color and LGBTQIA books in our displays and our work is really important. So I wanted to revisit really quick. I know we're kind of getting towards the top of the hour here. The appeals and doorways. So appeal terms are just different ways to sort of qualify why certain books work for readers, and that those deeper elements about what is animating a book beyond, say, the subject or the setting, right? Um, so appeal doesn't, one of the appeals that I feel like we still need to do some development on, even beyond what Novelist is doing, is worldview. Like some people really want an uplifting worldview, for example, or an anti-capitalist worldview, or there's a number of different things that will be meaningful and important to readers, and trying to think about what we've read and how they might fit into those categories is important. Molly Weta did this really beautiful work on her blog on looking at the four doorways. So Nancy Pearl, if you haven't watched her TED Talk, talks about the ways in which some of the appeals that we look at for books can be broken into four doorways, and that's people, prose, place, and why am I having person and people? So character, language, setting, and plot. And so thinking about how books sort of get what strengths they have, and sort of a pie graph, or like when people are talking, are they talking more about the characters? Are they talking more about the action and the fast pace? Are they talking more about the setting? Was it lyrical? Was it evocative? More about the writing? Was it terse? Was it again flowery, or really rich in its world building, in its evocation of a place? So listening to what people say and trying to translate that into appeal and doorways is one of the ways to do it. So thinking about storyline, the ways in which that author kind of approaches that work, character, what kinds of things they say about the character, what's important to that reader, writing style. Again, is it richly detailed or gritty or lush? Because language, I find, is sort of the trickiest appeal, because so many different people have value judgments around what good writing is. Nancy Pearl does like to say that a good book is a book you liked. So we also just need to understand that our understanding of what a good book is going to differ, or what good writing is going to differ. But I just want to, telescope out and just remind you that we get really nervous about this work sometimes. And finding the perfect match every time is just, not always going to happen. It's about the journey and the relationship and the experience that we've created for that reader. And that is a thing to really kind of be thoughtful around. Hindsight 2020, that person might walk away. You'll have some great ideas. Yes.
I just wanted to let you know, you mentioned the top of the hour. You have plenty of time. So
Okay.
I didn't want you to feel like you had to, I just wanted to make sure you do that. So
totally. Thank you, Jean.
It's always hard when we start on the 30 minutes instead of the top of the hour. So I just didn't want you to feel like you had to rush.
Right. Thank
and
you.
I'll just remind everyone, if you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat in the Q&A. I think we'll have lots of time for questions or book sharing or whatever we would like to end with. So you have lots of time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I'm in Pacific time zone, so I had to get up a little early. But I am not in a cold zone like yourself. So I wish you well as you weather the rest of this winter. It's okay about not getting it right, or even if they didn't like what you suggested. It's not about making us happy; it's about making them happy, and being in conversation with that reader, trying to find their next great book is really it's a journey, and you're not going to always hit it right. I think that showing that you're interested, showing that you're curious is really important. And this is, of course, true of reference too. Sometimes someone walks away and you found the right thing, you found that right article, and hopefully you've created an experience in an environment where they're going to come back, or you've found out a way to contact them later to share that resource. That's really where we add value, right? And create relationship. So one of the ways that you can continue to kind of invest in this work in little ways, again, we get pulled in so many different directions. Your job may not be just this. And like one of the academic librarians that, or library workers that commented said, it's so nice when someone walks up and wants something fun to read, right? I'm sure you're fielding all kinds of different, requests each day, some more in depth than others around research that students are doing, but they also need escapes from what they're doing. So, you may not get that question all the time, but what can you do to prepare for it? And some of it starts by building confidence in small ways and building networks with your colleagues. I imagine that at this conference, you're creating some networks across the state. Like I have a colleague that I'm sad that she's no longer working for the public library. She's a teacher librarian now. I can still IM her, but not like I used to be able to. I'd be like, hey, can you help me with this, reader who really likes YA fantasy? So finding those people that you can, phone a friend or reach out in that moment. So continuing to build networks, find out what people's reading passions are is really helpful. So yeah, in this work, just creating spaces for active learning and sharing with colleagues is important. Novelist is there for sure. It's kind of our auxiliary colleague, right? But what can you do to build networks across your system, especially if you're at a small branch? Who can you reach out to when you come across something tough, or you find a reader that is reading so voraciously that you can't always meet their need at that moment? But also try new things, read new genres. Again, I feel like we do make to some degree also our thinking around different genres isn't necessarily all of our own. Sometimes we're told by culture at large that romances are not worth reading, or horror is too gory, right? So what are the things that are actually your own thinking and are based on things you've actually read? And you're going to have no-goes, but there's more richness in some of these genres and some of than any of us really even realize until you sort of start diving into it, right? And also cultivate reflection where you are. Continual learning and critical practice is really important, and my team talks about it a lot. And part of it is just interrogating your current practice and positionality, the generative nature of what we do. Like what you know today is maybe not what you need to know tomorrow. And continuing to sort of like work through, what are the things that I was learning when I started that I need different now. And that's definitely a really important part of this work. So I want to say we do need to continue to connect those dots between RA and reference. Maybe there's ways that you can do that in your programming or with your colleagues. Narrative nonfiction, whole collection RA definitely needs more attention in a lot of our libraries, because increasingly we're having, again, sort of reference readers or even narrative nonfiction fans that want that feeling of reading a novel while getting a rich, information through their reading. How do we help those readers? How do we look at appeal and keep connecting those dots and help them find the next work that they'll enjoy? And then Robin Bradford's here again, I think next after your break. She's one of the people with Becky Spratford who do a lot of this work around actively anti-racist Readers Advisory. Readers Advisory has had a history of neutrality to some degree in relationship with the fact that we used to be very prescriptive and snobbish in our past. But we also are not in, a neutral space in our work. Our publishing industry is not a neutral space. We still need to do what we can to promote and expand people's reading availability to more representative voices, marginalized voices, right? So thinking about how you can do that in your community may differ from place to place, but that's part of the critical practice I was mentioning with my team that we continually think about. And some of that comes down to auditing your collection and your own reading habits. Are you reading widely? Are you reading, representative works? The Goodreads best of books last year came under fire for being mainly white writers. And what can we do to be continually making it known to publishing that we'd like to see more representation for ourselves and our communities? So looking for different kinds of representation is really important over time. And there's, some work you can do to challenge yourself and your readers, again, to try new things, to question some of their defaults around reading. Because based on appeal, something that they might not have thought was for them, they might try. If you're like, you know what, you really like a quirky character. Here's a book that's in a different genre, similar kind of snarky tone, you might really like this one. So these are the ways that we can also connect the dots for readers that they may not do on their own, right? Um, there's a program in my city that is aimed at getting adults reading over the summer, book bingo. And the categories that often get selected are kind of trying to expand people's reading and also sort of bring out the richness of our collections, right? The bestsellers aren't all that we do. There's a lot more there. So how do we highlight that? Both like looking at again, giving people kind of reading adventures. They don't have to read all these categories, but hip hop was one of them because it was the 50th anniversary of hip hop. Sea creatures, you could interpret that in a lot of different ways. Joyful, one year we had Black joy as a category. All to say, we often can look for opportunities to, nudge people and nudge ourselves, bring ourselves along in terms of reading things that might be different from what we read before. Um, so I wanted to kind of end there. I think we have a little more time for Q&A, for thoughts. But I just want to thank you for all that you do. Like, we work in a field that's increasingly challenging, right? Like we're continuing to have to adapt and change and work in a world that we're again seeing a lot more folks in crisis. And so I wish you well and thank you for letting me talk about books as our brand and Readers Advisory.
Thank you, Misha. This was awesome. And there's been a lot going on in the chat. There was a few questions, and there have been some answers in the chat as well. Emily says, my biggest challenge is with preteens and teens. Do you have any tips or suggestions?
Yeah, so I will admit that my strength is with adult readers, although I work with teens quite a bit, but not necessarily with teen readers as much as I once did. Some of the teens that are in my library aren't necessarily asking for reading suggestions. I would say that there's a lot of great sort of like resources out there and book influencers who will give you some ideas. Um, Alex Brown is actually one of them. That's one of the librarians that I mentioned above. And actually, Alex and I are doing a presentation for Book Lists RA Ideas and Practice in March on genre blends. But I would say ask some questions and say, hey, what do you really enjoy? And kind of go from there. And even if in the moment you're like, wow, I'm really struggling, just say, I'll get back to you. I'm going to look into this. I want to help you, right? So letting them know that you're going to actually maybe work on this a little bit, but I would reach out to colleagues. There are also great lists on ALA, like, the YALSA list, the Alex Awards. There's a number of different ways that you can kind of jog your thinking or think about what might be good for that reader. But I honestly can't pretend to be a teen librarian and help you really intensively, but some of those resources will get you started.
Thank you. And Candy also mentioned Book Talk and also to ask a school librarian. So a couple of other ideas for that. And then I just wanted to share that Jane said that once she had someone stomp up to the desk, slam a book down. They told me I had suggested it to them and they hated it. I told them, I'm sorry you didn't enjoy this. And then they asked me for a new suggestion. So even the failure was still a connection with them.
Yeah, we're not always ready for those moments when someone is vocal, but often the other thing too is that we're never the final arbiter. It's the reader that is. And yeah, you're like, okay, I thank you for letting me know. I mean, to some degree, that is a space of trust that has been created where they feel free to tell you, which is why often when I give folks books, because they feel this pressure sometimes. You're the librarian, you must know everything, right? No, we don't, right? We don't know them. And so giving them permission to come back and say, I often say this, totally come back and let me know if you did or didn't like it because it helps me help you further. And we also can't read every book. Like sometimes people will say they want to avoid certain things in books, and you can do all the searching in the world, and you might not always know that there's a scene in that book that might be really upsetting to a reader until they come back and tell you, oh yeah, that went into an area I told you I didn't want to go. I'm like, I'm so sorry, I can't read every book. Thank you for telling me. So it's a gift. Now, if they get real rude, that's a whole other thing. Set some boundaries. But yeah, that's great. I love that story.
Mhm. Thank you. And thanks, Jane, for sharing that. I have another question about, do you have any suggestions for finding more local or state authors? In particular, this patron has a patron who likes to read Wisconsin authors. And
Yeah.
I,
Do you have a local award? Like, do you have a state literary award?
we do. So yeah, so that is a good resource. It's the Wisconsin Library Association's Literary Award that comes out every November, and they read the books that were published the year before. So that's one
Yeah.
good source. Mhm.
I would look into that, but I also like one of your other resources locally is booksellers because they tend to really keep track of who's local, who's even like hyper local. So if you're needing help finding some of those things to some degree too, if you expand your search, novelist is a great place to start. Is it set in Wisconsin or is the author based out of Wisconsin? Because sometimes there's going to be folks writing in your state that don't even write about your state. So it just depends on what the reader wants or what you're trying to learn. But I would definitely reach out to a local bookseller, see if they've got some ideas that maybe you're not finding, and do some searching and see what comes up.
Thank you. And I was also thinking we have the Wisconsin Book Festival, which is not specifically Wisconsin authors, but I know they get a lot of Wisconsin-based authors as well.
Yeah.
Um, Catherine says narrative nonfiction is a great way to get reluctant middle schoolers to read, and it's come a long way since a child called it. I remember that book.
Oh, I mean, that was a huge, huge
That
book.
was
And
huge. Uh-huh.
yeah, and I mean, there's some of those books that we know were touchstones at the beginning of you know, um, this genre boom, right? But there's just so many more now. And yeah, you're right. The other thing too is that there's graphic novel nonfiction for adults and teens, and so there's a lot more being told in that nonfiction sphere in another format that is
Mhm.
really can be appealing to readers too.
Um, Another question, are there any good questions for people who have a hard time reading? So Emma, I think you're talking about like within the reader's advisory, like interview kind of thing. That's my sense of the question is there any good questions for people who have a hard time reading? Oh,
Yeah, I think some of it you can start by asking if for one, there's just so many different ways to read. Is it audiobooks that they need? Are they needing shorter works? Is it mood? Are they really finding it hard to find something that will suit their mood? Um, or are they really just needing to take a break? I mean, I think that some of our responses sometimes to times of stress are to read more, to read less. And that's all those responses are totally okay. But if they're wanting to read more, just finding out what they're really interested in and maybe fine tuning your questions to figure out what has been the stumbling block and has it been books that just weren't right for them? Or so many of us have. One of the things I didn't get to in this talk, which could be a talk of its own, is like how many of us were wounded by assigned reading, right? Like there's a lot of harm done in the ways in which we kill a love of reading in the educational system. Love teachers, don't get me wrong. But many of the times they don't get to scaffold their own curriculums or select their own materials. And there's a lot of people that, the last time they read a book that they enjoyed is a long time ago. So trying to figure out what is being asked, what's maybe not being said, and go from there.
Thank you. And a couple of other suggestions were about novellas to start
Mm.
small and work your way up. And then Angela says that she likes to ask about what TV shows they're binging lately to get a sense of what themes or styles they might enjoy.
Absolutely. Good
Yep.
call.
Yeah. And Emma says, thank you. Marvelous. So I think we got to the question that she was asking. And then in the chat, there were also some other helpful uh, like Midwest Independent Publishing and other small presses that only publish Wisconsin authors now. So a few other resources in the chat for that. So thank you for all of that additional information in the chat. I appreciate it. And then this was, I think, going back to Jane's comment about the person who said he didn't like the book. And she always tells people that it's not personal. She didn't write the book. So tell me your honest opinion. I love that response.
Yeah, that's great. I really like that. Yeah. I'm going to
Um,
stop sharing my screen so I can see the
okay.
chat.
Yeah. I was
This is,
also thinking, you had talked about reading outside of your typical genres. I do with a small group of other librarians. We do what we call notable books at the WLA conference every year. And a couple of years ago, I typically I have my thing. I read mysteries, I read some nonfiction and whatnot. And I would, when we pick the books, I would just pick books that I thought I would like. So one somebody came up to me afterwards and was like, you never talk about science fiction or you never talk about this. And I'm like, I don't usually read that. So give me some ideas. What would I like? How would that work? And so since that conversation, I've started incorporating um, science fiction or fantasy, things that I don't normally read. And one of the suggestions that she gave me after asking what I like, which was mysteries, she gave me a title of a science fiction book, and I'm not thinking of it now. That was science fiction, but had a mystery aspect to it. So the
mm,
mystery was as important as the science fiction aspects of the book. So
yeah.
to
Yeah,
me, that
those
was an
genre,
entry point.
those like as someone said, I think it was Bill here. So I mean, novellas are a great entry point for a lot of readers into different genres that they may not, have read before. And then genre blends, things that blend. Like one of the books that so really sort of jumped, I feel like, out of science fiction readers, entirely, or like just really caught a lot of readers is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir because it's a science fiction. I mean, its tagline is lesbian necromancers in space, but it's also a locked room mystery. It is like there's Agatha Christie locked in the middle of this bonkers science fiction novel, and sometimes finding those things that are again sort of like blending genres or a way in that you wouldn't necessarily think of is right. But Jean, thanks for sharing that because I think we all have those places where you realize, oh, my reading is maybe not as broad as I thought it was, and we all intend to read more broadly every year. And no, some of us still fail, right? You try, but in invoking Nancy, like one of the reasons that Nancy Pearl has been as popular and galvanizing as she is because she reads everything. She reads science fiction, fantasy, mystery, romance. So being open to reading everything, even if you don't love it all the time, can help you have, or even just learning, who recently read a thriller that they really liked. Having some enthusiasm behind sometimes helping that reader can really help a lot. But yeah, they do notice what we share and don't share.
Yes, they do. I also really like Nancy Pearl's Rule of 50 too,
Uh-huh.
to
Uh-huh.
to give yourself permission to set it aside if it's not working. Um, Jane asks, at my library, we're looking very intentionally at creating a structure around RA work. Does your library have a planned curriculum, training, or syllabus?
I love that, Jane. That's great. I would love to hear more about that, to be honest. We haven't in a while. So there's some trainings that we did sort of during the pandemic. My colleague and I did a recorded talk that both new librarians and LA4s can watch on basically just sort of nuts and bolts approaches to readers advisory, how to get started in the work and how not to panic, all that good stuff, right? And so that is available to people, but we haven't really re-upped that since 2021. I think our training needs are so huge now in terms of like working with patrons and patrons in crisis and social services sort of approaches to work that Readers Advisory has gotten sidelined, and we haven't had a structure in place in a really robust way. I hope that changes. I know my team often tries to share those sort of freely available things out there, book list, novelist. But Jane, I want to hear more. So if you're able to contact me offline, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I can connect you. Jane says that's true for us too. We're trying to get back to it as a core service. Um, Bill says we are also starting some structure to RA practices here. One of the things we are doing is just a small book talk from everyone at the start of our team meetings. I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, we try to do that when we can. And I think that's a really great way to, again, like um I really think it's good to know who is your local reader on X thing, because that can really help when you need, that. Oh, you read that book. Can you tell me more about it? Or what would someone who liked that like? So that's a great way to, again, colleagues as resources
Yes.
and creating that space.
Mhm. You mentioned I think it was a book list. What was that that you and Alex are doing?
Oh
What
yeah.
is the name of that? Because I registered for it, but I can't think of the name off the top
Oh,
of my head.
yes, of course. Yeah, I think they've done it for several years now. And actually, oh, by the way, so Robin Bradford and Becky Spratford did an amazing horror romance thing last year for that. So it's book list, reader's advisory, ideas, and practice. And yeah, this is going to be a really cool conference. And again, it's another way to keep sort of
Okay.
boosting some of that stuff that's, again, recorded later and you can access it.
Okay.
Yeah, was it? Oh, the name of that session is Screams and Swoons, which I'm just
Oh,
like,
yeah.
hello. So good.
Okay. I just
Uh,
found Becky's post about it. I was like, I knew I had. Oh, no, I don't want to do that.
so yeah, register. And then the lovely thing about so many of these, novelists only keeps them up for a little while. But if you register and can't attend, often there's still access for a little while before they have to take it down. But it's a way to kind of, again, kind of continue to get that into your practice.
Wendy says, if I can't read new books coming into the library, which I'm sure we all have all the time in the world to read all the books, she asks certain patrons to read it and give me an overview of the book. That way I can talk about the book to other patrons. So that's a great way to engage with your community on that as well. Great idea, Wendy.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, basically one of the ways that we think about that is a jacket talk. How do you like learn more about a book and boil it down to its essence so you can, tell people about it? But another way to kind of deepen that work, Wendy, is to like look at that new book that probably has some holds on it that your patron read and told you about. What is some backlist that you can set aside that reader might also like? So while they're waiting for X thing, what are some other books with similar themes, appeals that they might also like? So that can create displays and things like that too.
Thank you. We are almost at the, seems weird to say bottom of the hour, at almost to 11:30. So if you have any last minute questions, comments, thank you, Angela. I was just gonna to say that. And I think Robin was attending today, so you might have seen a few comments from Robin in the chat. She's our speaker for the 1 p.m. session. So I'm not seeing any other questions come in, so I'm gonna go ahead and do my wrap up here. So thank you so much, Misha, for this great session. This was really fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, there will be a short survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar and will also be sent in the follow-up email. We really appreciate your feedback. Our next session in this track is with Robin Bradford and begins at 1 p.m. Central Time, and we hope to see you there. And if not, we hope you have a great rest of your day and happy reading.